Let's say good morning to Andy Dunne. Andy, how are you?
I'm good, Ger. Thanks. How are you?
Yeah, we're very well. We were setting this piece up a little bit earlier on, and Eoin came up with the what was the exact phrase? Was it Andy must be delighted? What was the? How did you say it?
Well, I was just wondering, Andy, were the champagne corks popping in your household on Saturday as a result of one box kick, I think, for Ireland?
Yeah. I was at the game, and Conor Murray was practicing box kicks in the warm up, so I was fairly suicidal at that stage. But thankfully, it didn't transfer into the actual practice on the field. So I was glad not to see them.
Was this an Italy game plan, or is this the new Ireland?
I think there were definitely signs of a change. Probably none more signified than Peter O'Mahony's brilliant offload pass in the tackle. So little green shoots, yeah, absolutely a sign of a new departure in patches, and that's okay. I mean, you have to start somewhere. So,
What's behind that, Andy?
I just think that this is not a difficult transition for a top-level player to pass out of the tackle. I think it's at times is misunderstood that shift in, I suppose, strategy is not actually a difficult shift technically for top players. So I think what's behind it is simply a coaching team that are encouraging it as opposed to discouraging it, and that's a shift.
And it's as simple as that. It's like if the chance is there for you to play, because it's all Matty Williams pre-game going, this thing about heads up rugby, like that just means playing what you see. It's not a philosophy per se. The philosophy is you can only do what I tell you to do, or you can do what you think is right to try and win in that instance.
Yeah, you'd like to think top players have the capacity to. That buzzword of heads up rugby is really just a tell-all for a player having the wherewithal mentally to make the right decision at the right time. I think towards, for example, the tail end of the last regime under Schmidt, I think that became so diluted that the players at times looked like they were making awful decisions, but I think there was a weight of pressure on their shoulders to do what was prescribed as opposed to doing what they saw was maybe the right thing in front of them. And there was an element of fear in their decision making, which affected the technical execution of it. So I think if you're going to give players that power or that empowerment to use their skill set a bit more and to take a bit more risk, you have to take away the fear. And you could see in patches throughout the game, the likes of Stockdale's counter-attack that was unfairly disallowed, Keenan's second try that was disallowed. So you can see patches of that empowerment from the coaching team, which is very encouraging.
You are obviously a football fan, Andy, and like on this show in particular, we've been talking about how Stephen Kenny coming in is a bit of a battle for the soul of Irish football. The results have not been great since he's arrived. There have been no goals scored apart from one smacked in off the head of a centre-back. So it hasn't looked particularly creative when you just look at the box scores. But there have been chances, and we kind of feel ourselves watching it that actually they're trying something here. Is there going to be a period where the results are not great for the national team as we transition from the pragmatic, programmed team to what's coming next?
Well, yeah, I'm firmly in the Stephen Kenny camp, just to nail my colours to the mast, because that battle for the soul, I think we need that in an Irish sporting culture. I think certainly in the football sides we've accepted, I think, for too long that any result, draw or win or goalless draw is a good result, and that's all we're capable of, and yet we produce countless amounts of talented footballers. So I'm that shift for Stephen Kenny is a more difficult shift or a more difficult transition than in the rugby fraternity. I think it won't be, you get gimme games like we got against Italy. That's an ideal restart to your Six Nations. Anything below a 30-point win probably would have been a surprise. We don't tend to get that in the football world. So that battle for the soul of the fans and what's good to watch. I do think that's required. More than ever, I've heard absolute stalwart rugby fans saying they're a little bored. Rugby's become turgid. Rugby's become predictable. But in the last couple of weeks with the Bledisloe Cup, such exciting rugby down under, and then even the likes of last night, seeing a Munster side with 14 players born and bred in Munster playing an offload style game. There's lots of positives there for that shift towards more creative rugby. So definitely we're on the right track.
It's interesting listening to Peter O'Mahony as well. He was doing press yesterday and he says that the first day at the High Performance Centre, it was straight into skills. He says that was the first thing that we got into and we've just come out of it there this morning as well. So that we're constantly practicing it. It's bound to become part of your game. Was that a necessary step in your view, Andy, that there needed to be more of an emphasis on skills training in the Ireland camp?
Yeah, 100%. I'd be unequivocal. I think it's one of the great oversights at elite level sport that it's assumed the skills are honed, but in reality, it's something that can become rusty even in top level players. And as we started just at the outset with Ger, I think it is that easy just to switch it back on again, but it does need to be reiterated. It does need to be given value. It does need to be given time in training sessions. And I've often on air here with you guys harped back to a meeting I had with Steve Hansen at the peak of his All Blacks days. I met with Steve Hansen and Mick Byrne, and they said they would specifically dedicate more than 50% of all their training sessions simply to skills and skills development. And they were the best team in the world, and they were still doing that week in, week out, every single session. And they expected the top players then to go and do extras on top of that. So it's really refreshing to hear from an Irish camp where they're dedicating time to skills practice as opposed to practicing sequences of play. I think that's the easier part actually of the week. It's harder for top level players to get better at skills, but it's required.
And also, if they get better at skills, the improvement and the knock-on impact of that is going to be much more significant than getting one set piece right.
Well, if we try and keep a consistent theme in the chat, if you want to play heads-up rugby and you lack the skill set, you're unlikely to be able to do it. And the more skillful you are, the more armory you have at your disposal. And I think the ability then to see what is the right decision and then execute it under pressure, that is about skill. That's about thinking calmly under pressure. But ultimately, it comes back to your ability to execute. You know, some players at lower tier levels may know the right call or the right decision, but are unable to execute it, a 20-yard left-hand pass or a grubber kick off the wrong foot or an offload off, after a sidestep or something like that. So the more we practice the skills, particularly at that highest level, when you've only a millisecond to read the situation in front of you, then execute. Yeah, it's very heartening to see that development even in the last few weeks.
Let's talk a little bit briefly about the existential crisis that we have every time we play England or Saracens, where they have a bunch of big lads who bully us and we don't really seem to know what to do with that. The pattern has emerged relentlessly over the last 2 years, essentially. France have some big lads. We should not be walking into this game, and they also have a scrum that might kill us. So we can do all our fancy offloads and we can be at the full peak of our skillful powers, and we might get penalised off the park next weekend.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a trend that has emerged, like you said, in the last couple of years. I think firstly we saw England destroy Ireland prior to the World Cup. That first Six Nations game, which I think is burnt into our conscience back in 2019. I think that set a trend. Even in World Rugby, we saw England demolished us again pre-World Cup. Saracens effectively were more physical than Leinster in the European Cup final. But we saw in the World Cup even, England did it to New Zealand in the World Cup semi-final, and then South Africa did it to England. It became how important the scrum was, actually became central to the overall result in knockout games. So in a Six Nations match going over to Paris, I have no doubt in my mind that the French scrum, they're coached by a traditional French front row stalwart, William Servat, who's a Toulouse player, and he's got two Toulouse players most likely starting in the front row against us in Cyril Boyle and Julian Marchand at hooker. So the likelihood is the traditional French scrum approach is for the tight head and the hooker to work together. Those two young Toulouse players, coached by the Toulouse man in Servat, are most likely going to try and target our tight head, who will be Andrew Porter. So what we're looking at, I suppose, is going to be very exciting. Perhaps we'll be looking through our fingers over our eyes a little bit for those first 5 minutes, but it's really about Porter being able to absorb that pressure as a tight head. They're going to be coming at him from effectively two men coming at him from different angles and trying to squeeze Porter enough that he pops up and gives away a penalty. And if Porter can stay very low and absorb that attack for the first 10-15 minutes, that will have a huge outcome in the game. I think you'd encourage Porter and the Irish scrum coach, John Fogarty and Farrell, you'd encourage them maybe to allow Porter to think of nothing else except just absorb the onslaught, survive the onslaught, forget about contribution around the field, and that could have a really important influence on the overall game.
Porter's only 24, hasn't been a tight head all his life, and so you would hope that the level and you hope the acceleration in his improvement that we've seen in other aspects of his game will come with the scrummaging as well. So, it is definitely fingers crossed, though, that there's a big leap forward from the Saracens game recently.
Yeah, I think the front row union sometimes get shortchanged. I mean, if we were on air discussing a scrum half who couldn't pass but did everything else really well, they'd most likely be under severe pressure. I think we made a choice, clearly a choice at management level within the Irish setup a couple of years back, that we were going to get behind Porter as a tight head, but he probably didn't have that core scrummaging ability or that technical ability. And we really worked on trying to coach that into him. And he doubtless he has improved. There are props who know far more about the game than me: Emmett Byrne, Paul Wallace, ex-Lion, Peter Coyle, who I chat to regularly, and they're of the school of thought Porter might be a better loose head in time than a tight head. And interestingly, the probably the truest form of tight head that we've got in the squad is the Munster man John Ryan, who didn't actually feature. He wasn't released for any games recently, so perhaps there's a left field choice going on in the mindset of the coaches, and maybe they might spring a surprise John Ryan perhaps on the bench, who may be required to come on and weather a storm.
How big a blow is the absence of Gary Ringrose going to be to Ireland's chances this weekend, Andy?
I think that's a really significant blow. I think what Ringrose brings is what he doesn't get enough credit for is his agility in defence. He's brilliant footwork, but the role at 13 in defence is you link the midfield to the wider parts of the team. You link that up. You're a bridge in terms of your defence, and it's something that O'Driscoll never got enough credit for. Darcy and O'Driscoll at one time were world record holders in terms of partnerships in midfield. And the reason they worked so well together, even though it was highlighted all the time how much of a threat they were in attack, they were an incredible defensive duo. And they trusted each other. And Darcy gave O'Driscoll the license to hedge his bets a lot. And he had the agility and footwork then to cover the midfield and then bridge that gap to the wing. And that's where Ringrose has brilliant. He's brilliant anticipation, he's brilliant reaction skills, and that footwork and agility at 13 is vital. Now, he is coming up, he's not coming up against them this week, but the Irish team are coming up against Gail Fiku, Vic Vakatawa, Teddy Thomas, And they're so dangerous in that channel of the field that we need a 13 who's got very quick footwork and reaction skills. And with the absence of Ringrose, I don't know if we have that replacement straight away. Most likely only Farrell or McCluskey would come in. And we've also got onto the bench. We've obviously got Bundy Aki and Robbie Henshaw. They're typically more physical than they are agile, and so that loss of Ringrose and his agility and flexibility to change the defensive pattern is going to be a big loss.
Yeah, it sounds like you're predicting a French victory here, Andy.
Well, my heart obviously would always say Ireland, but I think the likely outcome is a French victory. Just given the couple of key losses we've had, I think the loss of Tyke Furlong, obviously it's not a new one, but that's going to have a big effect on the overall outcome. And I think Ringrose, again, it plays into the hands of where France are traditionally very strong, and this current side are really strong. That front row, coached by Servat, that new front row, and then obviously how dangerous they are in that 12, 13, 14 channel. And we just have, in terms of unfortunate timing with injuries, we don't have our first choice top level internationals going into that game in those positions, and I think we may struggle. Yeah.
All right, Andy, great to have you with us. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Ger. Thanks, Eoin.